Hey everyone, my name is Rick Gualtieri, and this is another Tales of a Midlist Author. What I'm hoping going forward is the sound quality of these, bumps up a notch. I have a new microphone set up here, courtesy of my friend, my good friend Sandy. I think she listened to the last couple and basically said, "Wow, your microphone really sucks." So she was good enough to kind of hook me up with a nice new setup here. So thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I do ask that you bear with me as I try to figure out things like proper gain and stuff on this, but hopefully it should result in cleaner sound. Not a better voice for me. Sorry, can't help with that. Anyway, I've noticed the last couple or the last several Midlist Author chapters here have mostly been about the business of writing and not actually about writing itself. So I wanted to step back and actually do one focused on the art of writing again, since this is supposed to be for helping beginner writers up their game a bit. And obviously that's that's all parts of it. That's the business and the writing part of it. But I won't say we've been beating the business part to death because there's so much more to talk about. But what I wanted to discuss is out there, another common thing I see a lot of authors asking about is, how long should my story be? First off, let me just mention a bit of a pet peeve for me. Whenever I see anybody asking, should I do this? Is it okay if I do this? Will it offend somebody if I do that? It's your story. Do what you feel is right for it. Asking for you're a business owner. Technically speaking, it's okay to ask for advice. Don't get me wrong, but when you put it that way, it almost kind of sounds like you're asking for permission, and quite frankly, you don't need it. That's up to you. So just a little pet peeve for me. Generally speaking, with regards to story length, and we'll also talk a little bit about story endings here, because I'm going to talk about chopping up your stories and whether or not that makes sense. But with regards to story length, for most of my stories, I tend to take the attitude that a story will be as long as it needs to be. I have short stories out there. I know my Shingles stories with the Authors and Dragons guys. Those are about 20,000 words each. That's under 100 pages. All the way up to The Last Coven, which is roughly about 200,000 words, closing in on 800 pages there. So I kind of run the gamut there. My general philosophy is that a good story will never be long enough, and a crappy story will always be too long, no matter how many words are in it. So I tend to focus more on quality than trying to hit like a mythical word counter or so. Or like, I'm drawing an imaginary line in the sand. That being said, I do know plenty of authors who do that. They set goals in mind. They practice towards reaching those goals, and they know how much of a story they can fit into, say, 40, 50, or 60,000 words, and they're pretty consistent with that. So there really isn't, I can't say that, any way is the right way. You have to find what's right for you. Personally, as I said, I kind of go with how long the story is. I get a plot in my head. I start writing it, or I start outlining it, depending on what I'm doing, and then I kind of see how long it goes. I'm writing two right now. One I think is going to turn out to be about 90, and I think the other might come in around 100 or 110. And the truth of the matter is I was aiming for 80 with both of them. It's just that the plots ran a little bit long. And I'm not really going to lose sleep over that, because ultimately, if it makes for a better story, that's great. I might be able to edit those down, because you want a story that's good, but also a story that's streamlined, not a ton of fluff, although I like a little bit of world building fluff in mine. That's kind of how I do it. But if you do want to get an idea for how long your story should be, I would say do research in the genre you're writing in. You can usually get an idea. For example, romance. Romances might tend to run a little shorter, whereas epic fantasy, those are those big George R. R. Martin sized tomes that you're going to see out there. Do you have to stick to that? No, not necessarily. You can write longer or shorter, anything. Again, if it's a good story, I think people will let you know that. If the worst case scenario you get is, wow, this is a really good story, I wish there was more of it. Well, that's not the worst thing in the world. But do a little research. That'll give you an idea for averages. For example, I write in urban fantasy. I would say the average goes up and down as people change their strategies, but I would say the average is anywhere from 60 to 100,000 words in urban fantasy. And it kind of goes back and forth. If you're writing shorter urban fantasy, 60,000, I personally tend to favor more towards the higher end, just because that's just the way I do it. That being said, it's not necessarily a bad thing to get practice in at writing at different lengths, especially if you're a longer story writer like I am, and you want to get used to writing shorter, stories. Look at things like anthologies or magazine subscriptions. I think my shortest story that's published out there is I did it for a magazine, and it's a 1,000-word flash fiction, and 1,000 words is not a lot, but that story has a beginning, middle, and end. It is a self-contained story. I know anthologies. It's pretty easy to get into an anthology where maybe the max is like 20,000 words or so. Always a good way to to do so. Worst case scenario is I sometimes like to use Twitter. I mean, I don't write stories on Twitter, but I try to put out full thoughts, and training myself to put out full thoughts in. Originally, it was 144 characters, but now I think it's 200 and some odd. But that's still pretty constrained. That's not a bad way to help you get those thoughts together to fit into a story length. So that's generally my rule of thumb: is do a little research. Unless you're artificially constrained, like I said, with a submission or so, and then do things like figure out yourself. Like when you find an ideal story length for your genre, depending on whether you pant or plots, figure out plot. If you do outline, figure out how many pages it takes to of an outline will translate into how many pages of a story, and then usually you can come up with a formula and make that fit going forward. As I said, I really don't do that, but plenty of writers do, and I'm not saying that their way is wrong or my way is right, because it's not. It's just different ways of going about it. One thing I will say is, and this is another pet peeve that bugs me, is when I see people say, hey, I have this story, it's long for my genre, it's 150,000 words. Do you think people would mind if I chopped it up into two and then sold it as two separate, because then I'll have more books in my library? I can't tell you how much that annoys the crap out of me, because you're kind of insulting your readers that way by assuming that they're not going to notice that you're giving them half a story. People aren't dumb that way. One thing I would say is, if you're writing a story to be multiple parts, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. For example, serials. Web serials are short, or online Amazon serials. They're relatively short. And the thing with serials is they mostly end in a cliffhanger. So it's kind of hey, Flash Gordon just saved his girlfriend, and he's just shot a few aliens. Oh no, his girlfriend had gotten caught by Ming the Merciless again. Will he be able to save her on time? Of course he will. But next week she'll be in danger again. Will he be able to save her on time again? That's kind of the thought behind serials. But with regards to artificially chopping up stories, one thing that annoys the crap out of me, and this also works for anthologies too, is giving somebody half a story that ends in the middle of a scene. Let's talk cliffhangers for a second. I'm not a fan of cliffhangers, especially when they're overdone, but sometimes cliffhangers are necessary. But here's the thing. What is a good cliffhanger versus what is a shitty cliffhanger? Well, a good cliffhanger is you've reached the end of the story. The story has a full beginning, middle, and end, and then the cliffhanger kind of leads off into almost kind of like another adventure. A shitty cliffhanger is, and some video games have done this too, which has torqued me off, which is, hey, we're leading up to a great war. All right, that's been the entire plot of the game, and suddenly it's oh, the war's about to begin. Stay tuned for the sequel to this game. That's crap, because you've just ended it in the middle of a scene. You haven't really fulfilled the promise to me, either the game or the reader, and you're probably pissing me off to the point where I'm not buying your next one, because at that point it kind of feels like a cheap money grab. So that's the other reason I don't like chopping up stories artificially, is because usually you wind up with that whole, stay tuned for next episode. And here's the other thing with well done cliffhangers versus crap cliffhangers. A well done cliffhanger leaves you satisfied with the story, Whereas a crap cliffhanger is obviously just an incentive to get you to buy the next book. And I think people can can tell the difference there. So those are my thoughts on story length and or the various ending a story, and how to kind of find your own way in that. As I said, I don't think there's any wrong answers. The only wrong answer is when you artificially do something to your story that you wouldn't have done if you weren't constraining yourself with some made up, I guess limit. I will say padding a story just to get extra page reads or size, that is probably far worse than editing a story down. You can edit a story down and still keep it tight and not cut out any elements you need. Versus padding a story usually feels like padding a story. And trust me, The Last Coven at 200,000 words, it can get kind of wordy. And I won't lie, I think I probably could have I edited out at least 20,000 words from that, and I probably could have edited it out more, just to streamline it. But I kind of wanted some of those details in there. So trust me, I understand that whole concept. I will say I try really hard never to pad a story more than it is, because again, people are not stupid. They understand when when this is kind of being done. Once again, my general rule of thumb is a good story is never long enough. Even if you read War and Peace there, it takes you weeks and weeks to get through it. If you love that story, it's not going to be long enough. Whereas a short story that stinks could be 5 pages, but that's going to be 4 pages too many. So something to keep in mind. Do your research. Don't cut corners. Put out the best story you can, and hopefully it all comes together for you. My name is Rick Gualtieri. This is Tales of a Midlist Author. It's a relatively short one, but I will hopefully talk to you soon. And again, hopefully the sound quality of this video is taking a step in the right direction. Talk to you soon.